I'd like to welcome everyone who is joining us virtually as part of this process that we're using to get to solicit public input on a draft rewrite of our public participation plan for the MPO. Today we're going to cover initially what is the Metropolitan Planning Organization. We'll be doing an overview of the new public participation plan and what we intend to try to accomplish through that. And then towards the end, we'll be covering ways that you can participate in this process and give us feedback on whether you think we got this right, whether you think there are some adjustments that are necessary, or whether something very different is more appropriate. So if you're following along remotely, we're on slide number 3 here. The Metropolitan Planning Organization is a federal program which is designed to give us, to give our local leaders input into transportation decisions that affect the region for a period of about 25 years. We use this process to prioritize what the region feels is important during that period of time, and also to have an honest conversation about whether we can realistically afford some of the higher priorities that have come out of this process. Under federal law, any project using federal highway or public transportation dollars must come through this MPO transportation planning process. But ultimately, what we want to try to accomplish is to identify a transportation network that functions for everyone that lives within our region, and also to decide how should that system look and operate. The MPO covers all of McLennan County, at least for the Waco MPO, and includes all of an area that we refer to as the census urbanized area for the Waco region. Those urbanized areas, by definition, have more than 50,000 population. For the Waco MPO, we are governed by a 20-member policy board composed of primarily elected officials, but also representatives from each of the nearly 20 incorporated cities within our region, as well as representatives from McLean County and the Texas Department of Transportation. That policy board is then informed by a 36-member technical advisory committee composed of planners, engineers, other key transportation stakeholders that provide advice and recommendations regarding projects within our region. And the whole idea is to find out what we as a region think are not only the most important projects, but the most effective projects at accomplishing the transportation goals for our region. So now I'm going to hand this over to one of our senior planners, Chelsea Flager, who is going to guide us through the new public participation plan, some of what we are trying to accomplish with this document, and then at the end explain to you how you can give us feedback on this draft plan. Chelsea, take it away.
Thanks, Chris. So I guess we'll start by saying, what is the Public Participation Plan, also known as the PPP, or the plan is probably the easiest way to refer to it. Well, this plan outlines the MPO's activities for soliciting public input into our process. The idea is we want to ensure that citizens have an opportunity to participate in our transportation planning process, and the plan identifies the minimum efforts that we'll undertake to solicit public input into our policy actions. The PPP is required by federal statute, so all MPOs have one. And the current plan shown here to the right was last adopted in 2007. And since then, it's been amended 6 times, with the last update happening last July in 2019. Next slide, please. Thanks. So why are we revising it this time around? Well, first, earlier this year, all MPOs in Texas started using a virtual meeting platform for our required meetings, such as our technical committee and our policy board meetings and our public informational meetings like this one right here. We're able to do that because our local and state emergency declarations that have been put in place for COVID-19 have allowed us to do so by suspending some of the Texas Open Meetings Act provisions. However, federal law has not been changed or suspended. So if we want to continue to do this, we do have to update this PPP to allow for virtual platforms as a provision. Next, please. So while we're here amending our plan, we thought that this would be a good time to take a look at the plan as a whole and see if there's a way to revamp it to better fit our current needs. Like I said in the previous slide or the previous few slides, the last plan was adopted in 2007 and it's had like small modifications and piecemeal updates since then. So it's a good time to look at the plan as a whole, reorganize it into a more user-friendly format. And there are a few other things we wanted to accomplish as well. We wanted to update the plan goals to better reflect our current responsibilities and priorities. We wanted to right-size our public involvement process to better reflect the variety of plans and processes that we do rather than have a one-size-fits-all approach. Of course, we wanted to add the provision for virtual meetings and public involvement, not only in response to COVID-19, but as part of a greater toolbox of strategies to provide better flexibility for public engagement. And we also wanted to add a new section for monitoring and evaluating our progress toward these goals. So this slide is giving you an overview of what I'll cover today. It's going to be a very brief overview of the major sections in the plan. So if you want to go and take a look at the details, you know where you can find them. So we're going to start by going over the new proposed goals for the plan, who the plan is for, so the target audiences, and how we're trying to accomplish diversity, inclusiveness, and equity with this plan, the different types of meetings that we hold regularly, some of the strategies in our public participation toolbox, an overview of the different types of policy actions and corresponding procedures that the MPO follows, and lastly, our monitoring and evaluation section. So here are our new proposed goals. The first one is to educate and inform the public. The goal here is to increase awareness of the transportation planning process, to provide timely and adequate notice of our meetings and actions so that interested persons have adequate time to participate. And we want our meetings to be transparent and accessible and provide translation when needed. Goal 2 is to engage diverse audiences. So we want to provide a number of different ways for the public to engage in our process, and we're going to strive to eliminate barriers to participation. We want to identify and engage with a variety of different stakeholders representing different demographics, interests, and geographies. And then we want to share this input with our policy board and technical committee and facilitate like a two-way information flow between our boards and committees and the public. Our third goal is to meet legal requirements. We do have a number of federal and state legal requirements for meeting noticing and public comment opportunities. So we want to be sure that we are adhering to those. And lastly, we want to evaluate our efforts. We want to review data for our public input processes and our public comment periods and adjust as we go along to better meet the goals of this plan. And we also want to review and document how public input has influenced our transportation planning and programming decision making. So who's this plan for? Everyone, but specifically, we want to specifically reach out to certain types of target audiences. This list here are examples of these types. So for example, transportation modal interests, those who use our roadways, public transit, our airport, micromobility, so those who like to ride scooters or operate them, freight, private transportation, and rideshare. Those are just some examples. Also examples are some special interest groups like environmental interests, emergency response, our visitor industry, and our traditionally underserved communities such as minority and low income populations. Next slide, please. which leads us to our diversity, inclusiveness, and equity goals. So the Waco MPO incorporates environmental justice and limited English proficiency into our planning studies and programs, and this is required federally. So in the Waco area, EJ populations include Black and Hispanic individuals and low-income individuals and households. And our LEP populations include native Spanish speakers. So the PPP must include these EJ and LEP populations as target audiences, and that helps us to ensure fair and equitable participation by these groups in our transportation decision-making process. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to move on to the different types of meetings that the MPO regularly holds. So we have our policy board, our technical committee, and we have a bicycle and pedestrian work group. We also occasionally have other subcommittees or work groups that are established as needed. And the public can participate in many of these meetings regardless of the topic of discussion, but as you'll see in a couple of slides, the scope of participation will vary based on the purpose of the meeting. And we just want to put this out there that if there's an emergency order in place, such as one we're under now, the directives of those orders may end up superseding some of our policies. This table summarizes our regularly scheduled meetings. It provides the frequency, the general location, and the usual date and time. All of this information will be available on our website, and there are going to be some times when either the location or the date may change, but that will always be noticed in advance, and our website will be up to date with that. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of information on this table, but the idea is to show you that we have requirements for when and how we notice our meetings and the information that will be posted on our website. And these tables help both us as staff and you as the public or the stakeholder. So for us, it helps us set the standard and helps us to stay on schedule for making sure that we're providing our adequate and timely noticing to the public. And for the public and stakeholders or the media, it helps to set expectations for what kind of information they can expect from us at the MPO and when that will be available. So in a couple of slides, I'll show you another table that provides a little bit more context for when these website and noticing guidelines will be applicable. Next, please. So we did want to spend some time to talk about the public hearings. So the MPO Policy Board regularly holds public hearings at their meetings. Public hearings are a really good way for the public to formally address the board. Anyone can speak to any item on a policy board meeting agenda, regardless of whether or not a public hearing is included for that item. And also, all of the policy board meetings end with an opportunity to address the board, regardless of whether or not it's included on the agenda, with the caveat being the board can only respond if it is indeed an agenda item. So if you're interested in participating in a public hearing, it is recommended that you register your intent to speak with MPO staff or submit comments in writing prior to the meeting. That helps us be sure that the policy board chair knows to pause and allow time to speak. We will say that right now in our virtual meeting format, we are requiring that you submit comments or register in advance. And the reason for that is because we need to be sure that adequate meeting permissions are set up prior to those meetings. Next slide, please. So here's an example of the kinds of summary tables that you will see in the plan. This one summarizes those different types of meetings we just talked about and provides the different website posting, noticing, and public participation opportunities that are available. As you can quickly see here, they have the most check marks on the policy board meeting. That's because policy board meetings offer the most opportunity for public participation. On the opposite end of the spectrum is an executive session, as you might expect. Next slide, please. So moving on to our public participation toolbox. So this is a new section in our plan. The point of this is to include a whole range of different tools and strategies that the MPO may use to help us achieve our plan goals and also be compliant with our laws and regulations. We want to be able to use this toolbox to tailor our public participation process to best match the scope of the planning document or the policy action, or maybe the target audience or stakeholder or other circumstances. So we really want to have the opportunity to be flexible and nimble for the task at hand. And I do want to say that there will always be a minimum level of noticing and public participation for each type of policy action. Next slide, please. And this is the methodology that we use to help us organize our toolbox. So this is the International Association of Public Participation's spectrum of public participation. And this is used in the planning industry. And what it does is it provides a scale, a sliding scale of increasing impact on a public decision or a policy decision. So on the left-hand side is inform. So these are tools or strategies where, in this case, the MPO would have the goal of informing and educating the public about the process or a decision. And all the way on the right side, you'll see empower and collaborate, in which the public has more opportunity to influence the decision. I will say that in our plan, you won't see any of the empower strategy, and that's because of the way that the MPO is set up. The policy board has the ultimate decision-making authority, and therefore the highest level of participation that we can feasibly offer is collaborate. Next slide, please. So here's an example of what the table looks like in the plan. You'll see the different types of strategies on the left, some description of what that might entail, the format, whether it is an in-person or virtual or both strategy, and the levels of participation that will be available. So like this first example, you'll see a community workshop or an open house. It offers all the way up to collaborate, where members of the public and stakeholders really have an opportunity to discuss with staff what their vision might be or their goals for the policy action at hand. Next slide, please. Here are some more examples. You can see that at the bottom you have MPO staff speaking opportunities. And this is an example of a strategy where our goal really is to educate and bring awareness to the MPO and what we do. So in this case, it's inform only. Next slide. So the next section of our plan talks about MPO actions and procedures, and we've organized our policy actions into major and minor actions. Major actions generally include adoption of new plans or programs, and it also includes any modifications to the public participation plan. Major actions offer more opportunity for comment and participation as opposed to minor actions, which are typically amendments to existing plans or programs, with a couple of exceptions, which we'll go over soon. Minor actions could also include significant policy statements by the policy board. So for example, if the policy board wants to come out formally in support or potentially in opposition to a policy or a program, this is something that could be considered a minor action. And minor actions would have a streamlined public comment or participation process. MPO staff also has other tasks that we do. For example, we have annual reports, and while those are made available to the public upon request, it's not something that requires policy board action. So it's in its own separate category. Next slide. So this table details all of our typical documents and shows you what will be considered a major action or a minor action. And the highlight here for the UPWP, or the Unified Planning Work Program, has some changes that are new to this version of the PPP. So I'll discuss that on the next slide, please. So the UPWP is the MPO budget. So it describes the tasks and planning activities that the MPO will perform for this period. We're proposing a couple of changes to this. So adoption of a new UPWP would still be a major action. It's required every 2 years minimally. However, most amendments will remain a minor action. And this next part is what we're proposing as a change. If we have an amendment that is less than $25,000, we're proposing that would be a streamlined process. So in this case, we would only have the public comment at the public hearing during the meeting. It does require policy board approval, and it does mean that it would be included in the meeting packet and information that would be posted in advance on the website and sent out as part of our normal noticing process. And the reason we're proposing this change is we've historically had very low turnout and very low interest in these UPWP amendments. And what we're trying to do is balance the need for public comment and timely budget approval. And we think this approach helps us to get there. Next slide. So we're also proposing a couple of changes to our public comment periods, highlighted here in yellow. The public participation plan comment period is established by federal law, so that will remain the same. But we're proposing to reduce the major and minor action comment periods. And again, the reason for this is we typically receive the comments on the front end, and having a longer comment period has not historically resulted in more comments or more engagement. So we think this shortened comment period, again, will help us balance public input and being able to move forward with projects in a timely fashion. Next slide. So here's a preview of the mega table in the plan. So this kind of goes through all of our major actions, all of our major documents, and the corresponding approval process, noticing requirements, and the minimum public participation or outreach that corresponds with it. So as an example, shown here is our Metropolitan Transportation Plan, the adoption. That is the third line item. It has a lot of check marks associated with it. That's because that is one of the biggest documents that we do. You can compare that to a transportation improvement program amendment, which is a smaller task. It's similar to a capital improvement program. And you'll see that there are less check marks there simply because it's, and the scope of it, it's a smaller task. Next, please. And then the last section of the plan is monitoring evaluation. And again, this is a new section. The reason we wanted to include this is because we want to see if what we're doing works. And we want to have the opportunity to have performance metrics to measure against and to understand what our desired outcomes are and how each of these strategies is helping us move toward one or more of our plan's goals. So I'll show you a table on the next slide, but first I want to also say that in this section, we also detail our social media policy and what we're going to do to try and maintain a Section 508 compliant website. So here's an example of what our monitoring evaluation plan looks like. We have the measurable strategies on the left, the associated performance metrics, what our desired outcomes are, and which of the 4 goals each strategy addresses. So that's it for the plan. So where are we in the process? Right now, we're in the middle of our 45-day comment period. We are accepting comments through November 6th. We're having our public informational meetings today, so we'll have another one at 5:30 p.m. And then we will have a public hearing at the November 19th policy board meeting with policy board actions scheduled for that same day. And now is the time for you to ask us questions or send us comments. You can contact us in a number of ways. You can email us or call us, and this presentation will be posted on our website for you to review when you have time. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Chelsea. Once again, we will be posting this presentation on the MPO website so that you can view this information when it's convenient for you. And just as a reminder, we are accepting comments through the end of the day on November 6th. And action is proposed by the MPO Policy Board during their November meeting. Look to our website for the time, location, and the way to log in to that meeting to remain informed on this particular policy board action.